Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast. Here we ask a simple question of the history and the actions that have shaped our lives.
Did this leave us more free or more governed? Because what we do not know can be used to govern us.
And what we choose to ignore always will.
"36 words. In the summer of 1776, in a rented room in Philadelphia, a 33-year-old Virginian sat at a portable writing desk of his own design and composed a single sentence that would outlast every empire then standing on earth. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Think about that again. Not as sloganeering, not as the words you sort of remember from a grade school assembly or a fireworks display. Think about what is actually being claimed. A document announcing a dissolution of a political bond did not need to say any of this. It could have listed grievances and stopped. It could have appealed to the rights of Englishmen, to the British Constitution, to the simple failure of a distant king to govern well. Instead, 36 words into its most famous passage, the Declaration reaches past Parliament, past the common law, past every earthly authority whatsoever, and appeals to truth. Not custom, not tradition, not even history. Truth. And not just any truths, but truths held to be self-evident. Where do those truths come from? Who discovered them? And if they are truly self-evident, plain as daylight, obvious to any honest mind, then why did it take 2,000 years of argument and the blood of so many men to put them into a sentence? That is the question this series exists to answer. Welcome to the road to 1776. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions podcast. This is episode 1 of our new series, Self-Evident, The Road to 1776. And today's episode is titled, The Golden Thread. This episode corresponds to Article 1 of our written series, published last Sunday on our Substack page. It is the opening installment of a 22-week journey, and so it does double duty. It introduces the whole series, even as it begins. As always, the podcast expands on themes from the article, provides additional primary sources, and addresses complexities that the written format cannot fully explore. So please, thank you for stopping by, and let us begin. You ever notice something strange about Americans? We memorize the Declaration, but we rarely interrogate it. We can recite the famous lines, we carve them into marble, we print them in civics books, and we read them aloud on the 4th of July, or sometimes the 2nd, Mr. Adams. And almost never do we stop to ask the most obvious question a curious mind could ask. Where did Jefferson get this? The remarkable thing is, we don't have to guess. Jefferson told us, and he told us not in the heat of 1776 when a man might be forgiven claiming originality, but at the end of his life, when he had nothing left to prove. Jefferson passed on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration itself, July 4th, 1826, 200 years ago. On the same day, his friend and rival, John Adams, also died. A year earlier, in the spring of 1825, Jefferson received a letter from a man named Henry Lee. Lee was asking, on behalf of others, about an old accusation that Jefferson's declaration was not original, that he had borrowed it, that perhaps he had lifted it from John Locke or from an earlier draft by someone else. Now, you might expect the author of the most celebrated document in American history to bristle at that charge, to defend his originality 49 years prior, to insist that the words were in fact his own. He did the opposite. He agreed. In his reply on May 8th, 1825, Jefferson explained that the Declaration was never meant to be original, and he said so without a trace of embarrassment. Its object, he wrote, was not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of. Its authority, he said, rested on what he called the harmonizing sentiments of the day. Sentiments found in conversation, in letters, in printed essays, and in his memorable phrase, in the elementary books of public right. And then he named them. The elementary books, he said, were those of Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney. Sit with the audacity of that list for a moment. The author of America's founding declaration tells us in plain language that his document was a synthesis, not an invention. And the four men he names spans 2,000 years, 3 languages, and 4 entirely different political worlds. Aristotle, the Greek who wrote 3.5 centuries before Christ, tutor to Alexander, the man who first dissected constitutions the way a biologist dissects a specimen. Cicero, the Roman consul and orator who died in the convulsions that ended the Republic, his hands severed, nailed to the forum as a warning to anyone else who might speak freely. Locke, the cautious English physician and philosopher who published his great work on government anonymously, because in his England, putting your name to such arguments could cost you your liberty or your life. And Sidney, Algernon Sidney, the Whig who went to the scaffold in 1683, beheaded on Tower Hill, in part because a manuscript found in his study said that kings could be resisted. The book that helped kill him was published 15 years later. Jefferson read it. So did half the men who signed the Declaration. 4 men, 2,000 years, and Jefferson places them in a single line as the elementary books from which the American mind was made. He was not boasting of his reading. He was describing a fact. The 56 men who signed the Declaration, lawyers, farmers, physicians, merchants, ministers, shared a common library. They had read the same classical authors, very often in the original Greek and Latin. They had wrestled with the same English constitutional texts. They had absorbed the same Scottish moralists and the same French philosophers. And they did this not as a hobby, but as working equipment, arguments to deploy, precedents to invoke, frameworks to apply to the crisis bearing down on them. So to understand what the Declaration means, we have to understand what its authors meant by it. And to understand that, we have to know what they read. Which brings us to one of the most revealing facts about the founding generation. A fact that hides in plain sight. In a room full of books. In 1814, British troops marched into Washington and burned the Capitol. Among the casualties was the Young Library of Congress, then a moderate collection of a few thousand volumes, reduced to ash. The man who stepped forward to rebuild it was Thomas Jefferson. By then, an old man at Monticello, land rich and cash poor as Virginia planters tended to be, he offered Congress his personal library. And what a library it was. When the wagons were loaded and the books counted, the collection came to 6,487 volumes. Not 600, not a gentleman's shelf of favorites. Nearly 6,500 books in Greek, Latin, French, Italian, Spanish, German, and English, covering law, philosophy, history, natural science, agriculture, architecture, music, and theology. At the time, it was the largest and most carefully chosen private library in America. And it was the working library of the man who drafted the Declaration of Independence. Here's the detail we should absorb. When some in Congress objected to that Jefferson's collection was too broad, too philosophical, too full of books that had nothing to do with the practical business of legislation, Jefferson's answer was that there was, in fact, no subject to which a member of Congress might not have occasion to refer. The whole of human knowledge, he believed, was the proper equipment of a self-governing people. That's not the attitude of a man who thinks library is a matter of slogans. That's the attitude of a man who thinks liberty is a discipline. And Jefferson was not unusual in kind, only in degree. James Madison kept a comparable working library in Montpelier. John Adams read so ferociously and argued so hotly in the margins of his books that his personal volumes, preserved today in the Boston Public Library, are a running quarrel with the entire Enlightenment, scrawled in his own unmistakable hand. You can open any of Adams' books and watch him fight with the author across 2 centuries. George Washington, whom we do not usually think of as a bookish man, left more than 900 titles at Mount Vernon. And Alexander Hamilton, at the age of 20, wrote a pamphlet called The Farmer Refuted, in which he cited Grotius, Pufendorf, Locke, Montesquieu, Blackstone, and Hume, much of it apparently from memory. But the single most instructive story in this whole picture is the friendship between 2 men and a series of trunks crossing the Atlantic. In the autumn of 1784, James Madison, then a Virginia legislator, not yet the figure that we would come to call the father of the Constitution, wrote to Jefferson, who was serving as the American minister in Paris. Madison wanted books. Specifically, he wanted books on how republics and confederacies actually worked, ancient and modern, the successes and the failures. And Jefferson, in Paris, became his friend's book buyer. Over the following months, he shipped trunk after trunk back across the ocean. Histories of the Achaean League, of the Amphictyonic Council, of the Lycian Confederacy, of the Swiss cantons, of the Dutch United Provinces, of the German Empire, the confederacy of the past packed into crates sailing west. Madison received them and went to work like a man cramming for the most important examination of his life, which, in a sense, I guess he was. He read, he took notes, he distilled. And by April of 1787, 6 weeks before the Constitutional Convention opened, he had produced 2 preparatory documents, one called Notes on an Ancient and Modern Confederacies, the other, Vices of the Political Systems of the United States. Those documents were the intellectual ammunition Madison carried into Philadelphia. And much of what he carried into Philadelphia became the Constitution of the United States. Let's be precise about what this means. Madison did not invent the idea of a compound republic, a government of governments, a power divided between the center and the parts. He found it. He found it in the histories Jefferson shipped him and in the ancient authors he had studied since he was a young man at Princeton. The most original political architecture in modern history was built, in large part, out of books about leagues that had risen and fallen over 2,000 years. Now, which books mattered most? This is not a matter of guesswork either. A political scientist named Donald Lutz did something painstaking. He went through 916 political writings published in America between 1760 and 1805. And he cataloged more than 3,000 citations every time an American writer of the founding era quoted or invoked an authority. And the results are illuminating. The single most cited source, by a wide margin, was the Holy Bible, roughly a third of all citations. Among the secular authorities, Montesquieu came first, Blackstone second, and Locke a little behind. And the classical authors, Plutarch, Cicero, Tacitus, Livy, Polybus, taken together, outweighed any single contemporary author. These were not decorative references. This was the living vocabulary of the American political argument. And then there were the pamphlets. The talk radio, podcasts, and substacks of the 18th century rolled into one. There was a series of essays called Cato's Letters, written by two Englishmen, Trenchard and Gordon. These were written in the 1720s, arguing for natural rights, religious toleration, freedom of speech, and resistance to tyranny. They were reprinted in colonial newspapers so relentlessly that the historian Bernard Bailyn argued Cato's Letters, even more than Locke himself, gave the American Revolution its most immediate, everyday vocabulary. When a Boston printer or a Virginia planter reached for the language of liberty, the words that came most readily to his hand were often Trenchard and Gordon's. So here's the picture. The founders were not men of pure instinct who happened upon liberty by accident. They were readers. Their political thought was cultivated, not improvised. And every author they had read himself had been a reader, drawing on someone earlier. Pull on the thread, and it does not end in 1776. It runs backward, hand to hand across the centuries. These ideas were not the founders' discoveries. They were their inheritance. And that raises the next obvious question. If the ideas were inherited, how do we judge them? How does a free person tell a good idea from a dangerous one? For that, you need an instrument. And the instrument is the most important tool you will carry with you throughout this series. Now I'll hand you a cipher, a decoder ring, a Rosetta Stone, not a slogan, but a tool. You will carry it with you through every episode of this series, and my hope is that you'll carry it with you for the rest of your life. It is the single most important instrument in the arsenal of liberty, and it comes in three questions. Here's the first question. In terms of an act between peoples, could an individual morally do this to another individual, whatever this is? Take any action a government performs, strip the uniform off it, and imagine you yourself personally doing it to your neighbor, in your own name, with no government anywhere in the picture. Would that act be recognized as just? Or would it be a crime? Here's the second question. If an individual could not morally do it, can a group of individuals delegate that power to a government? And this is the crux of the whole argument. Government is not a different kind of creature from the people who compose it. Rather, it's a set of agents acting on authority handed to them by the principals, by us. And an agent cannot exercise a power the principal never possessed. You cannot hand off or delegate what you never had in the first place. And here's the third. If both answers are no, for whatever act it is that needs to be doing, if no individual may do it, and no group may delegate it, then the action is aggression, no matter who performs it. The badge does not change the ethics. The robe, the fancy hat, the shiny metal on the breastplate does not change the ethics. The vote does not change the ethics. The act is the act. That is the liberty test. And let me make it concrete, because in the abstract, it can sound like a philosophy seminar puzzle, and it's really anything but. Suppose your neighbor knocks on your door and demands 35% of your earnings as protection. If you refuse, he says, men will come and you will be taken from your home, from your family, and you will be locked in a cage. You would not call that a tax. You would call it extortion, armed robbery even, and you would be right. Now, suppose he comes back with 10 neighbors, and all 11 agree that they are entitled to a share of your earnings. Has anything changed? It has not. 11 robbers are still 11 robbers. Suppose 100 of them sign a petition. Suppose 1,000. At what number does the taking stop being theft and start becoming legitimate? There is no such number, because your consent is the only consent that can authorize an action taken against you. The agreement of other people to take your property is not your consent. It is just a larger crowd, a mob. Yet, this is precisely what the modern state claims. That what one person may not do, that 10 may not do, that 1,000 may not do, 100 million can do. So long as the taking is run through the proper forms, the proper offices, the proper paperwork. But by what philosophical magic exactly is the aggression laundered clean? Now, I want to be fair, and fairness is a discipline I will hold in every episode of this series. The founders understood this difficulty. They did not pretend to have dissolved it. What they tried to do was minimize the taking, to make the consent as real as it could be made, to enumerate and to limit the powers, to chain the rulers down with a written constitution. And even then, and this is the part we forget, even then they warned us over and over in genuinely alarmed language that the system they built would not keep itself. That is a thread we will follow all the way to the end of this series. Let me first give you the shorthand for the test, because it will come back again and again, and I want it to ring in your ear. Fancy hats and larger mobs. Fancy hats. Officials wear them. The titles, the seals, the ceremonies, the official cars, the flags, the courtrooms. None of it changes what is actually being done. A police officer who seizes property without cause has seized property without cause. A legislator who votes to take half of your labor has voted to take half of your labor. A president who orders the killing of a man no court has convicted has ordered an execution. The costume is decoration. The act is the act. In larger mobs, democracies add a second claim on top of the costume, that a majority may do what no individual may. That 2 wolves and a sheep vote on what's for dinner is by no means a transformation of consent for the sheep. Think about it this way. 10,000 people seizing property in the street with no authority, we call that a riot. 10,000 people doing it through the proper procedure, we call it an election. The procedure is real, and it genuinely does matter. A regular, predictable, accountable process is enormously better than a mob in the street. But better is not the same as legitimate. Organizing aggression into orderly forms is an improvement over chaos, but it is not the same as turning aggression into consent. Now, the test will not answer every question in a single stroke. Many real questions turn on the facts, on the details of institutions, on hard judgments about consequences. The test does not pretend to settle all of that. What it does is it sets the bar. Any action that fails the test bears a heavy burden. It has to show some very strong positive reason why the delegation is somehow legitimate in any way. Most of what the modern administrative state does fails the test outright. And one of the quiet purposes of this whole series is to help us see clearly, for yourself and for myself, exactly why. I've called the inheritance of the founders, of us today, the golden thread. And now I want to tell you where it runs, because one of the most important things to understand at the outset is that this inheritance belongs to no single people. It is not the property of the West, or of Christendom, or of England, or of any one tribe. It is a common human achievement, and it had to be, for reasons I will explain in just a moment. Let me trace the route quickly, because you can see the whole map before we start walking it inch by inch. For us in this series, it begins in Athens, where the Greeks asked the foundational questions: what is justice? What is law? What makes a city good? And where Aristotle dissected the constitutions of his world and gave us the idea of mixed polity, balancing the one, the few, and the many. It moves to Rome, where Polybus studied the Roman Republic's separation of powers, and where Cicero gave us the formulation that echoes straight through to the Declaration: that there is a law above all human law, discoverable by reason, binding on every rational being everywhere. The same in Athens and in Rome and in every age. It runs to Jerusalem, where the Hebrew covenant tradition planted a genuinely radical seed, that even the king is under the law, not above it, under it. That ruler and ruled alike are bound by a higher order than the throne. It passes through Baghdad and Cordoba, where Islamic scholars Averroes, Avicenna, Al-Farabi preserved and commented on the Greek philosophical corpus during the very centuries when most of it advantaged from Christian Europe. We need to be honest about this, because the school book story usually skips it. There was a long stretch when, if you wanted to read Aristotle, you very often had to read him in Arabic, or in a Latin translation made from the Arabic. Europe rediscovered its own foundations partly through the libraries of the Islamic world. It moves into the medieval synthesis, where Thomas Aquinas wove natural law into Christian theology, and where the barons at Runnymede forced a king who believed himself above the law to put his seal to the Magna Carta, and thus concede that he was not. It runs through the Reformation, where Luther stakes everything on the liberty of conscience, and where Calvinist thinkers develop the dangerous and consequential argument that a tyrant may be lawfully removed. It passes through the Dutch, who built the first modern republic, through Sir Edward Coke, who declares from the bench in England that common law will control even an act of parliament that defies reason, and is dismissed for saying so. Through the levelers of the 1640s, who demand written constitutions and popular sovereignty a century and a half before Philadelphia. Through Sidney, who dies for his book. Through Locke, who publishes his anonymously. It runs into the Scottish Enlightenment, where Francis Hutchinson teaches that rulers may be tested when they betray the people's trust, and where Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations in the very same year the Declaration is signed, 1776, the year that gave the world both its political and its economic charter of liberty in a single 12 months. It passes through Montesquieu in France, who systematizes the separation of powers. And, at a fork in the road, we will watch the liberty tradition that produced 1776 diverge from the rationalist tradition into one that produced 1789 and the guillotine. Same century, same vocabulary, widely different destinations. That fork is one of the most important things this series has to teach. And finally, the thread that reaches America, where colonists were already living self-governing lives, drawing even on the great law of peace of the Iroquois Confederacy, a functioning federal union of nations that Benjamin Franklin pointed to directly. They wrestled with charters, fought a revolution, wrote a constitution, met the Anti-Federalist objection, and codified the Bill of Rights. Now, why does the breadth matter so much? Why do I insist on Baghdad and Cordoba and the long houses of the Mohawk alongside Athens and London? Because of this. Here's what I take to be the deepest argument in the whole series, and let me be clear. These truths were independently discovered at different times by different peoples in different languages from different starting premises. The Stoics of Rome and the prophets of Judea and the jurists of Cordoba and the schoolmen of Paris and the common lawyers of London and the moralists of Edinburgh and the Sachems of the Iroquois Confederacy, working apart, often in total ignorance of one another, kept arriving at overlapping conclusions about human dignity and the limits of power. And convergence is evidence of reality. When independent observers with no opportunity to copy from one another keep reporting the same thing, the honest conclusion is not that they all shared a coincidence. The honest conclusion is that they were all looking at something real. That is exactly why these truths can be rightly called self-evident. Not because everyone sees them at a glance, but because honest minds, reasoning carefully from different directions, keep finding the same thing. But, and here I have to stop and bring balance, because an honest history owes its strongest opponents a real hearing. Not everyone accepts this. There are serious people with serious arguments who say the whole inheritance thesis is wrong. I'm going to give you 3 of their best objections right now in their strongest form before I say a word against them. You should chew on these and hold them open as we go along. The first is economic interpretation. It goes back to a historian named Charles Beard, who argued in 1913 that the founders were not philosophers at all, but property holders. That the Constitution was less the fruit of high-minded natural rights reasoning than a machine built to protect the creditor class and the holders of public securities from debtors and from popular redistribution. On this reading, the soaring universal language of the Declaration was cover, a beautiful rhetorical flourish draped over hard class interest. And a later generation of scholars extended the critique that all men in 1776 really meant white, propertied, adult males, and that the latter expansion of liberty happened in spite of the founders, not because of them. The second objection is the particularist critique. It says that rights language itself is culturally local, a Western invention of the 17th and 18th centuries, a product of one specific Protestant commercial Enlightenment movement. Natural rights on this view are not universal and do not reflect any discoverable moral order. They are simply one culture's set of preferences, no more privileged than the preferences of societies built on hierarchy or honor or clan. And to press natural rights frameworks on peoples who never chose them, the critic says, is itself a kind of imperialism. The third, and this is the most serious of the three, is the utilitarian challenge. It runs from Jeremy Bentham, who flatly called natural rights nonsense upon stilts, to John Stuart Mill, who in 1859 made the case for liberty more beautifully than almost anyone before or since. But notice how Mill made it. He grounded liberty not in any natural right, but in its fruits, in human development, in the progress of truth through open argument, in the general happiness. Liberty, for Mill, is justified because it works. Now, each of those arguments deserves respect, and each will get a full episode's worth of engagement later in this series. But let me tell you briefly why I do not think any of them finally defeats the inheritance. Against Beard. Later historians, Forrest MacDonald foremost among them, took Beard's claim apart on the evidence. When you actually examine the economic holdings and the political positions of the men at the convention, the neat alignment Beard claims simply does not hold. Yes, the founders held property. Yes, a stable order served property holders. But to say that their decades of study, Madison's trunks of books, Adams arguing in the margins, Hamilton citing 6 authorities from memory at 20, reduces to financial self-interest, is to explain away the best documented intellectual preparation in American history. The window dressing theory cannot account for the windows. Against the particularist critique, the claim that all rights talk is merely cultural is, by its own logic, also merely cultural. If there is truly no discoverable moral order, then the critic cannot turn around and tell me that cultural imperialism is wrong. Wrong in any sense beyond its own local preference. The position eats itself. And beyond that, as this whole series will show, the tradition is simply not exclusively Western. Hebrew, Islamic, and Native American thought each contribute load-bearing pieces. The Greeks who first asked the questions did not think of themselves as Westerners. This is a human inheritance, open to anyone who will pick it up. Against the utilitarian, Mill. And this is the one that sometimes keeps me up at night, because Mill is so good and so humane. Here's the difficulty. If liberty is valuable only because it produces good outcomes, then the moment a confident enough expert or a large enough majority becomes persuaded that coercion will produce better outcomes, liberty has to yield. That's not a hypothetical. That is the exact door through which the administrative state walked in the 20th century. Mill himself spent his life honorably trying to bolt that door shut, and he could not. And his successors did not even try. The natural rights tradition answers differently. It says a person may not be used as a mere instrument for someone else's happiness because a person is an end himself, not a means. That is firmer ground. That is ground you can actually stand on when the confident experts come knocking. You do not have to take my rebuttals on faith today. The arguments will unfold across the whole series, and you can judge them as they come. But I want you to know from the first hour that this series is not going to hide from its hardest critics. It is going to walk straight up to them, and let's have a debate. So let us bring this whole episode down to a single point you can use the moment you turn this episode off. Here's the lens. The next time you encounter any exercise of government power, a tax, a regulation, a licensing rule, an emergency order, a court ruling, run it through the 3 questions. Could you, an individual, morally do this same thing to your neighbor? If not, could a group legitimately delegate that power to an agent who acts in their name? And if both answers come back no, then you are looking at aggression. However fine that hat, however large that mob that authorized it, it is aggression. It's not cynicism, and I want to be very clear about that because it would be easy to mistake this for cynicism. And that is the opposite. The liberty test is not a counsel of despair about government. It is a standard of honesty about government. The same standard the founders tried, imperfectly and heroically, to build into a written constitution. They knew they had not solved the problem. They handed us a system designed to keep the aggression minimal, the consent real, the powers few, the rulers accountable. And they begged us to maintain it. The test is simply how a free person keeps faith with that charge, one law at a time. That is what it means to read the Declaration with your eyes open, not as a poster on the wall, as an instrument. We begin with wonder, and I want to end there too, because wonder is the right first response to what those 56 men did. 2,000 years of human thought, Greek and Roman and Hebrew and Islamic, English and Scottish and French, the wisdom of the Longhouse and the wisdom of the Academy, converged on a single sentence written in a Philadelphia room in the summer of 1776. Men who had read Aristotle in Greek and Cicero in Latin, who carried Sidney and Locke in their memories, who had argued across oceans about Hutchinson and Hume, distilled all of it into 36 words. Wonder is the right first response. But wonder alone is not enough, because the founders did not hand us a finished thing. They handed us charge. What must free people understand to remain free? That is the question that drives this entire series, and I put it to you as directly as I know how. The ideas do not preserve themselves. They live only as long as they are known, understood, applied, taught, and defended. Every generation that inherits them faces exactly the choice the founding generation faced: to receive the inheritance, refine it, hand it forward, or to let it dissipate through neglect until only the monuments remain and nobody alive remembers what they were for. This series is a small contribution to keeping it. And I want you to know what is coming, because it is going to be a remarkable journey. Athens is coming, and Rome. Jerusalem is coming, and Baghdad and Cordoba. Magna Carta is coming, and Aquinas and Luther and Koch and the Levelers. Sidney is coming, and Locke and Montesquieu. Hutchinson and Smith are coming, and Jefferson and Madison and Mason, and the unlovely but utterly essential company of the Anti-Federalists, without whom we would have no Bill of Rights at all. And at the very end, we will stand back and ask, what have we done with the inheritance? And what, even now, might yet be done to recover it? This is the road to 1776, and I am genuinely glad you are walking it with me. Next Saturday, in episode 2, the classical inheritance, we go back to the beginning of this thread, to Athens and to Rome, to Aristotle's anatomy of the constitutions, and to the moment Cicero put into words the idea of a law above all human law. That is where the discovery begins. And this coming Tuesday, in our first contemporary application episode, Why This History Matters Now, we take the liberty test out of the seminar room and apply it to a live policy debate of our own moment. And I will introduce you to the people and institutions carrying this tradition forward today. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 1 of Self-Evident, The Road to 1776 on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page over at consequentialactions.com. There you'll find all written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause, the New Leviathan, and Empire of Liberty. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. And follow me on X at @JKellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.